In the rundown neighborhood of East Riverside, where graffiti-covered brick walls and broken streetlights created pockets of shadow, everyone knew Harold Chen. They called him the crazy dog man, sometimes to his face, more often behind his back. At 73 years old, Harold was thin and weathered, his clothes perpetually stained and worn, his hands scarred from decades of manual labor and recent years of feeding animals with sharp teeth and uncertain temperaments. Every morning at dawn, Harold would emerge from his tiny basement apartment, carrying plastic bags filled with food scraps, leftovers from restaurants that knew him, day-old bread from bakeries, meat trimmings from butcher shops. He would make his rounds through the alleys and abandoned lots of East Riverside, calling softly in Cantonese and English, and the dogs would appear. Strays, abandoned pets, feral animals born on the streets. They knew Harold's voice, knew his routine, knew he was safety and sustenance in a world that wanted them dead or gone. The neighborhood's opinion of Harold ranged from annoyance to open hostility. Mrs. Peterson, who owned the corner market, complained constantly. "He's attracting vermin. Those dogs are dangerous. Someone's going to get bitten. And then what? He should be arrested for public nuisance." The property developers eyeing East Riverside for gentrification saw Harold as an obstacle to progress. "He makes the neighborhood look bad," said Marcus Webb, who had purchased 3 buildings on Harold's block. "Investors don't want to see some old man feeding packs of wild dogs. It's unsanitary and it's making my properties harder to sell. Someone needs to do something about him." The police had been called dozens of times. They would find Harold in an alley, surrounded by 15 or 20 dogs of various breeds and sizes, all eating peacefully from bowls he had laid out. The officers would warn him about city ordinances regarding stray animals, about health code violations, about complaints from residents. Harold would listen politely, nod, apologize, and promise to stop. Then the next morning, he would be back in the same alleys, feeding the same dogs. "Why do you do this?" Officer Sandra Martinez had asked him once, genuinely curious. "You barely have enough money to feed yourself. Why spend what little you have on stray dogs?" Harold had smiled, his weathered face creasing deeply. "Because nobody else will. These animals, they didn't ask to be born on streets, or to be abandoned by families who promised to love them. They're hungry and scared, and just trying to survive. Like many of us, yes? Who helps those everyone else has decided don't matter? Someone must." But compassion wasn't valued in East Riverside, not when it came from a poor old man who looked homeless himself, and certainly not when it benefited creatures the city considered pests. The discrimination Harold faced wasn't just about the dogs. It was about class, about age, about his immigrant background, about his refusal to be invisible in the way society expected poor elderly people to be. Teenagers would harass him, knocking over his food bowls or throwing things at the dogs to scatter them. Business owners would chase him away from their properties with threats and sometimes violence. City officials would fine him for violations he couldn't afford to pay, leading to warrants and court dates he would miss because he couldn't take time away from his rounds. The dogs depended on him, and Harold never missed a feeding. Harold had been a skilled carpenter once, had owned a small furniture-making business, had been married with 2 daughters. But his wife had died 15 years ago. His daughters had moved to other states and stopped calling, and age had made his hands too unsteady for fine woodwork. His savings had been depleted by his wife's medical bills and his own health problems. He lived on a tiny Social Security check that barely covered his rent and basic necessities. But every dollar he could spare went to the dogs. He skipped meals so they could eat. He wore the same clothes for years so he could buy dog food. He lived in a basement apartment with no heat, so he could afford meat scraps from the butcher. His entire life had become about caring for creatures that society wanted to forget. The dogs knew what the humans didn't. Harold Chen was a saint. He had names for all of them. Bella, the 3-legged pit bull who had been hit by a car. Old Timer, the ancient golden retriever someone had dumped when he got too expensive to maintain. Shadow, the black shepherd mix so shy she would only eat after all the other dogs had finished. Harold knew their personalities, their fears, their favorite foods. their injuries that needed monitoring. He also worked tirelessly to find them homes. He would photograph the friendliest dogs, create simple flyers, and post them at community centers and pet stores. He had successfully placed 47 dogs in loving homes over the past 5 years, each placement making him happier than anything had made him since his wife died. "One more saved," he would say, his eyes bright with tears of joy. "One more who will know love." But the neighborhood didn't see his rescue efforts. They only saw a crazy old man making their streets look poor and dangerous, attracting animals they wanted eliminated. The mockery and harassment intensified. Someone spray-painted "Dog Man" trash on the wall near his apartment. A petition circulated demanding his eviction. Local news did a story about the stray dog problem in East Riverside, featuring B-roll footage of Harold feeding animals and interviews with residents who wanted him stopped. Harold endured it all with quiet dignity. He had survived the Cultural Revolution as a child in China, had immigrated to America with nothing, had built a life through hard work and determination, had lost nearly everything to death and age and circumstance. The insults of privileged people who had never known real hardship couldn't break him. The dogs needed him. That was enough. On a cold Tuesday morning in late November, Harold didn't emerge from his basement apartment. The dogs waited in the alleys, confused and hungry. By afternoon, some of them had gathered outside his building, whining and scratching at the door. By evening, concerned by the unusual canine congregation, a neighbor finally called the police to check on Harold. They found him in his apartment, dead of a heart attack, a bag of dog food beside his bed that he had been preparing for the morning feeding he would never make. He had died alone, in poverty, in a neighborhood that had mocked him until the end. The city's response was efficient and impersonal. Remove the body, contact next of kin if any, dispose of unclaimed property. Just another dead old man in a city full of them, notable only for having been a minor nuisance in life. But the dogs knew something had changed. As Harold's body was removed from his apartment, they gathered, not just the 20 or 30 regulars from his feeding route, but dozens more. Dogs from across the neighborhood who had been fed by Harold at some point. Dogs who remembered his kindness. Dogs who sensed that their protector was gone. Harold's daughters were notified of their father's death through official channels. Neither came to claim his body. "We haven't spoken to Dad in years," his older daughter Susan told the funeral home director by phone. "He chose those dogs over his family. Let the city deal with him." The younger daughter, Patricia, was slightly more forthcoming. "Our father became obsessed after Mom died. We tried to help him, tried to get him into senior living, tried to reconnect. But he pushed us away. Every conversation became about those strays. Every dollar we sent him went to feed them instead of himself. It was like losing him twice. Once to grief, once to those animals. I'm sorry he's dead, but I'm not coming. There's nothing left to come for." With no family willing to claim him, Harold became the county's responsibility. He would receive a pauper's burial, the cheapest casket, the briefest service, a grave in the county cemetery section reserved for the unclaimed and unremembered. The funeral would be held on Friday morning at 10 a.m. at Riverside Funeral Home, a modest establishment that handled most of the city's indigent deaths. Father Thomas O'Brien from St. Mary's Catholic Church agreed to perform the service, despite Harold not being a parishioner. "Every soul deserves to be sent off with prayer," he told the funeral director. "Even if nobody comes, I'll be there to commend him to God's mercy." But people did come, just not the people the funeral home expected. Officer Sandra Martinez, who had warned Harold so many times about the dogs, showed up in uniform. "He was a good man," she told Father O'Brien. "He broke ordinances, yes, but he broke them for the right reasons. Someone should be here for him." Jenny Kim, who ran the Korean restaurant on 5th Street, arrived carrying flowers. "Mr. Chen came to my restaurant every Wednesday," she explained. "I would save food scraps for him. He was always so polite, so grateful. He would tell me about the dogs he was helping, show me pictures of ones he had rescued and found homes for. He had such love in his heart. How could I not come? Marcus Chen, no relation, who owned the butcher shop, came with his teenage son. Harold was a customer for 10 years, he said quietly. Always bought the cheapest cuts, the scraps I would have thrown away. But he was unfailingly kind, always asked about my family, always had a positive word. Last month I learned he wasn't eating those scraps himself. He was feeding stray dogs. All those years, going hungry so animals could eat. I'm ashamed I didn't help him more. Others trickled in. The bakery owner who had sold Harold day-old bread, the teenager who had once helped Harold rescue a dog stuck in a storm drain, the elderly woman whose lost poodle Harold had found and returned. A handful of people who had seen past the mockery and prejudice to recognize Harold's humanity and compassion. But as the service was about to begin, something unprecedented occurred. The doors of the funeral home opened, and Maria Santos appeared, breathless and agitated. Maria ran the local animal shelter and had known Harold well. He had volunteered there for years before age and health made it impossible. "Father O'Brien," Maria said urgently, "you need to see this. The whole city needs to see this." She led the small gathering of mourners outside, and what they saw stopped them cold. The street in front of the funeral home was filled with dogs. Not a dozen or 20, but hundreds. Dogs of every size, breed, and description. Some were clearly strays, matted fur, visible ribs, wary eyes. Others were obviously pets, well-groomed and wearing collars, having somehow escaped yards or homes, or slipped leashes from walking owners. They had converged on the funeral home from across East Riverside and beyond, drawn by something humans couldn't understand. The dogs weren't aggressive or chaotic. They sat quietly, arranged in loose rows, their eyes fixed on the funeral home entrance, waiting. Some whined softly. Others remained silent, but all of them were there for Harold. "My God," Father O'Brien whispered. "I've never seen anything like this." Officer Martinez was already on her radio, calling for backup. "We have a situation at Riverside Funeral Home. Hundreds of dogs. I don't even know how to describe it. Just send units." The funeral home director was panicking. "We can't have the service with all these animals outside. It's unsanitary. It's dangerous. Someone call animal control." But Maria Santos stepped forward. "These dogs aren't dangerous. They're mourning. They know Harold is here, and they've come to say goodbye. We're not calling animal control to have them rounded up and probably euthanized. That would dishonor everything Harold stood for." As police units arrived and news crews got wind of the story, the crowd of human mourners grew. People from the neighborhood came to see the spectacle. Some of the same people who had mocked Harold and called him crazy were now standing in stunned silence, witnessing the loyalty and love he had inspired in the creatures everyone else had discarded. Inside the funeral home, Father O'Brien faced a decision. "We can't keep these animals outside indefinitely. We can't clear them away without risking harm to them or traumatizing them further. So we have one option. We bring Harold to them." The funeral director objected strenuously, citing regulations and protocols. But Father O'Brien's authority prevailed. "This man spent his life caring for these animals when no one else would. In death, they've come to honor him. We're going to let them." And so, Harold Chen's funeral became something extraordinary. His simple casket was brought outside and placed on a raised platform in front of the funeral home. Father O'Brien conducted the service in the open air, his voice carrying over the gathering of humans and animals alike. "Harold Chen was called many things in life," Father O'Brien said. "Crazy, nuisance, fool. But looking at this gathering, I see the truth the mockers couldn't see. Harold Chen was beloved. He was loved by creatures who couldn't speak their gratitude in words, but who speak it now through their presence, their loyalty, their grief. He gave everything he had, his money, his time, his comfort, his very food, to help those who society had discarded. That is not craziness. That is sainthood. After the service concluded, the funeral procession to the cemetery began. The hearse carried Harold's casket slowly through East Riverside's streets, followed by the small convoy of cars carrying human mourners. But behind them came something unprecedented. Hundreds of dogs, following the hearse in a massive, solemn procession. They maintained a respectful distance, but never wavered. Dogs who had been enemies on the streets walked side by side peacefully. Aggressive animals became docile. Fearful creatures found courage in the collective purpose. They were united in honoring the man who had honored them. The procession moved through the neighborhood at walking pace, and as it passed, more people emerged from homes and businesses to witness it. The images were striking and surreal. An old man's casket followed by a river of dogs, flowing through streets like a living memorial. Mrs. Peterson, who had complained so bitterly about Harold, stood on her doorstep crying. "I called him a nuisance," she said to her husband. "I called animal control on him dozens of times. I wanted him arrested, and he was just feeding hungry animals. What kind of person does that make me?" Marcus Webb, the property developer, stood outside one of his buildings watching the procession pass. His phone rang, a potential investor wanting to discuss the properties. Webb silenced the call. "I don't know if I can sell these buildings anymore," he told his assistant. "I spent months trying to get rid of this man because he was bad for business. But he was better than all of us. He cared about creatures we wanted eliminated because they weren't profitable. What does that say about our values?" The teenagers who had harassed Harold and tormented his dogs watched silently from a street corner. One of them, a 17-year-old named Tyler, broke down. "We threw rocks at him," he sobbed to his girlfriend. "We knocked over his food bowls. We thought we were tough, thought we were funny. We were just cruel to someone who couldn't fight back. And he never said a mean word to us, not once." The procession took 45 minutes to reach the county cemetery, a journey that should have taken 15. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting images that would soon go viral. Hundreds of dogs following a casket, their loyalty transcending death, their devotion shaming the humans who had failed to match it. At the cemetery, Harold was to be buried in Section G, the paupers section with its small flat markers and efficient rows. But cemetery officials faced an immediate problem: what to do about the dogs. There were too many to contain or control, and attempting to drive them away seemed both futile and cruel. "Let them stay," Father O'Brien said. "They've walked this far. Let them see their friend to rest." The burial service was brief. As Harold's casket was lowered into the earth, the dogs sat in a massive semicircle around the grave, hundreds of them bearing witness. Some howled, a mournful sound that echoed across the cemetery. Others whimpered or barked softly. Many simply watched in silence, their grief palpable to everyone present. When the first shovel of earth hit the casket, a sound rose from the canine gathering, a collective whine that gave voice to loss and gratitude and loyalty that transcended species. It was a sound that would haunt everyone who heard it, a reminder that love and devotion weren't uniquely human qualities. Officer Martinez, standing at attention in her uniform despite being off duty, found herself weeping openly. "We failed him," she said to her partner, who had also come. "The whole city failed him. We harassed him for helping animals we should have been helping ourselves. We called him crazy for showing compassion we lacked. Those dogs understand something we didn't. That man was a hero." As the burial concluded and people began to leave, the dogs remained. They stayed by Harold's grave through the afternoon and into the evening. Cemetery workers tried to shoo them away gently, but they kept returning. Eventually, officials gave up. "Let them mourn," the cemetery director said. "They're not hurting anything. They're just saying goodbye." By the next morning, Most of the dogs had dispersed, returning to wherever they had come from. But a few remained, the core group that Harold had fed daily, the strays who had depended on him most. They lay near his grave, refusing food or water, beginning the vigil that would become legendary. The viral nature of Harold's funeral attracted national attention. News outlets across the country ran the story. Hundreds of dogs attend funeral of man who fed them. Social media exploded with the images and videos. The story resonated because it captured something people needed to see. Evidence that compassion mattered, that small acts of kindness had enormous impact, that the forgotten and dismissed could be heroes. But the attention also exposed uncomfortable truths. Why had Harold been alone? Why had a man who inspired such loyalty in animals been mocked and harassed by humans? Why had his compassion been labeled insanity when it should have been celebrated? The story became a mirror reflecting society's failures back at itself. The week after Harold's burial, Maria Santos from the animal shelter made an announcement. Harold Chen left no will, no estate, nothing but a basement apartment full of dog food and supplies. But he left an example. Starting today, we're establishing the Harold Chen Memorial Fund, dedicated to feeding and rescuing stray animals across the city. Every dollar will go directly to the work Harold did alone for so many years. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from across the country, $10 from a child who had seen the funeral on TV, $5,000 from a wealthy business owner who had been moved by the story, everything in between. Within a week, the fund had raised $200,000. Within a month, it exceeded $1 million. Local restaurants and grocery stores began donating food scraps systematically to the shelter. Veterinarians offered free services for rescued strays. Volunteers signed up to help feed and care for the animals Harold had left behind. The city that had mocked one man for his compassion was now channeling that compassion into organized action. Harold's daughters, shamed by the public attention and their absence from their father's life, reached out to Maria Santos. "We want to help," Susan said. "We were wrong to abandon him. We can't make that right now, but we can honor what he cared about." They donated the small amount of money Harold had saved, $3,247, every penny of which had been earmarked for dog food, to the memorial fund. They also donated family photos and Harold's few personal possessions to create a small memorial display at the animal shelter, telling the story of who Harold Chen had been before poverty and loss had reduced him to the crazy dog man in people's eyes. The city government, embarrassed by their years of harassment and fines, announced new programs, designated feeding areas for stray animals, increased funding for animal control that emphasized rescue over elimination, and a partnership with local shelters to address the root causes of the stray population. Marcus Webb, the property developer, made a surprising announcement. He was donating one of his East Riverside buildings to serve as a free veterinary clinic and shelter, to be named the Harold Chen Compassion Center. "I spent months trying to erase this man from my neighborhood," Webb said at the press conference. "I saw him as an obstacle to profit. I was wrong. He was the soul of this community, and I was trying to destroy it for money. That changes now." The teenagers who had harassed Harold approached Maria Santos, asking how they could help. Under her supervision, they became regular volunteers at the shelter, working with the same animals they had once tormented. Tyler, who had thrown rocks at Harold's dogs, became one of the shelter's most dedicated workers, saying, "I can never apologize to Mr. Chen, but I can try to finish what he started." 6 months after Harold's death, East Riverside had been transformed. The neighborhood that had mocked an old man for feeding strays was now known as the most animal-friendly community in the city. Stray populations were down, not because animals had been killed, but because they had been rescued and adopted. Feeding stations operated throughout the neighborhood with volunteer schedules and donated food. Every animal that had been part of Harold's daily rounds had either been adopted or was receiving regular care. The dogs that had maintained vigil at Harold's grave eventually dispersed to new homes. Bella, the 3-legged pit bull, was adopted by Officer Martinez. Old Timer, the ancient golden retriever, went to live with Father O'Brien at the church rectory. Shadow, the shy black shepherd mix, found a home with Jenny Kim and her family. All of Harold's regulars found love and safety, their adoptions facilitated by the Memorial Fund and the attention Harold's story had brought. On the first anniversary of Harold's death, hundreds of people gathered at his grave for a memorial service. Many brought their dogs, both pets and former strays Harold had helped. Father O'Brien led prayers and spoke about Harold's legacy. Harold Chen was mocked for feeding strays, Father O'Brien said. He was called crazy, a nuisance, a fool. But when he died, hundreds of dogs followed his coffin because they understood what his human neighbors had failed to see. That compassion is never wasted, that kindness is never foolish, that loving the forgotten makes you not crazy but Christ-like. Harold fed animals when he barely had enough to feed himself. He gave everything he had to creatures society wanted eliminated. And in doing so, he showed us what it means to truly love. Maria Santos unveiled a memorial marker at Harold's grave, replacing the simple flat stone with an elegant headstone that read, Harold Chen, 1950-2023. He fed the hungry, rescued the forgotten, and loved the unloved. The dogs knew his worth even when humans didn't. Among those attending the anniversary memorial were Harold's daughters, reconciled to their father's memory if not their past relationship with him. We thought Dad had lost his mind, Patricia said. We thought he was wasting his life on stray animals. We didn't understand that he had found his purpose. He couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix everything, but he could feed hungry dogs. And he did, every single day, until he died. That's not crazy. That's heroic. The Harold Chen Memorial Fund continued to grow and expand. It funded feeding programs in 3 neighboring cities. It partnered with schools to teach children about animal welfare and compassion. It offered grants to people who wanted to rescue and foster strays but lacked resources. It became a living monument to one man's refusal to look away from suffering. But perhaps the most touching tribute came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Peterson, who had complained about Harold more than anyone, began a daily ritual. Every morning at dawn, the time Harold had made his feeding rounds, she would walk through East Riverside's alleys and vacant lots, checking on the animals, ensuring the feeding stations were stocked, talking softly to the dogs the way Harold had. I mocked him, she told a reporter who noticed her routine. I made his life harder when it was already so hard. I can't undo that, but I can continue what he started. Every dog I feed, I think of him and apologize. And I hope that somehow, wherever he is, he knows that his compassion wasn't wasted. It changed us. It changed me. Harold Chen had lived in poverty and died alone. Society had labeled him a nuisance and treated him accordingly. But he had lived according to values that transcended social acceptance or financial success, compassion, consistency, and an unwavering commitment to helping creatures who couldn't help themselves. And when he died, hundreds of dogs followed his coffin. Not because they had been trained or commanded, but because they loved him. They remembered every meal he had given them when they were starving, every gentle word when they were frightened, every moment of dignity he had offered them when the world treated them as disposable. The mockers had been wrong. The skeptics had been wrong. Harold Chen hadn't been crazy. He had been something far rarer and more valuable. He had been truly good. And his goodness had inspired loyalty that death couldn't break and love that mockery couldn't diminish. His legacy wasn't money or property or fame. His legacy was hundreds of dogs who lived because he had fed them, dozens who found homes because he had rescued them, and a community transformed because his death had forced them to confront their own cruelty and choose compassion instead. Sometimes the forgotten change the world. Sometimes the mocked become heroes. Sometimes one poor old man feeding stray dogs matters more than all the wealth and power and prestige society values. Harold Chen proved that truth. The dogs that followed his coffin proclaimed it, and East Riverside would never forget the lesson. Thank you for experiencing Harold Chen's extraordinary story. This is the reality for countless people who quietly help animals while society mocks them, harasses them, and tries to make them stop. Harold died alone and in poverty, mocked until his final day. But hundreds of dogs knew his worth, and their tribute forced a community to confront its cruelty and choose compassion instead. If this story moved you, please share it immediately. Share it with anyone who feeds strays, anyone mocked for caring about animals, others dismiss, anyone told their compassion is foolish or wasted. Let Harold's story inspire others to continue caring, even when the world tells them to stop. Like this video and subscribe for more true stories that challenge our assumptions about worth, value, and what really matters in life. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change how you see the world. But don't just watch. Take action. Feed a stray animal. Donate to your local shelter. Volunteer with rescue organizations. Adopt instead of shop. Support people like Harold who are doing this work right now, often mocked and always under-resourced. And if you see someone feeding strays, don't mock them. Thank them. Leave a comment. Have you helped stray animals? Have you been mocked for compassion? What would you say to Harold if you could? Your voice matters. Remember, they mocked Harold Chen for feeding strays. But when he died, hundreds of dogs followed his coffin, teaching humans that compassion is never crazy, that kindness is never wasted, and that the forgotten often see clearly what the privileged miss. Subscribe now, share this story, and help create a world where people like Harold are celebrated, not mocked. Where compassion is valued, not dismissed. Where doing the right thing matters more than social approval. Your action today could save an animal tomorrow. Harold's legacy continues through everyone who chooses compassion over cruelty.